At 7:26, the garage held the day's last light in a thin strip beneath the door. The grocery bag sat on the floor near the shoes, its paper sides soft from being carried in one hand while the other hand found the light switch. Around it were boxes from another decade, taped and retaped, marked in fading pen, holding things no one had needed for years but no one had been ready to let go. She stood there for a moment, still in the quiet patience of an occupational therapist, still a grandparent, still the person who noticed whether someone nearby had settled under a blanket. The house behind her was beginning to lower its sounds. A sink ran once, then stopped. A chair moved. Somewhere, a door clicked softly. And the grocery bag, ordinary as it was, seemed to hold the shape of care that had come home without knowing what to say. She did not pick the grocery bag up right away. For a while, it was enough to see it there, leaning slightly to one side, the top folded over without care, the corner of a cereal box pressing against the paper from inside. One handle had twisted during the walk from the car. The other had fallen flat against the concrete, as if it too had finished carrying what it could. The garage was not a room anyone tried to make beautiful. It had the extra shoes by the step, the old snow shovel that stayed there even in warmer months, the folding chair stacked against the wall, and the boxes that had followed the family from one house to another. Some boxes had names written on them in marker. Some only had words like photos, winter, baby stuff, old files. The kind of labels that sound practical until one evening, years later, when they begin to feel like little doors. She stood in the part of the room no one photographed. Not the kitchen table after everyone gathered. Not the living room with the lamp turned low. Not the hallway where the family pictures hung in neat rows. Here, there were scuff marks on the floor, a grocery bag with one can rolling sideways inside, and the slight smell of cardboard, dust, and the outside air that had come in with her coat. The day had asked a lot. It had asked for careful hands. It had asked for listening. It had asked her to notice the small tremor in someone's fingers, the tired way another person tried to stand from a chair, the little hesitation before someone admitted that the stairs had become harder than they used to be. She knew how to make a room safer. She knew how to say, with her voice calm and even, that they could try again slowly. Then she came home and became ordinary again. A grandparent. A person with groceries. Someone who knew which light in the garage flickered before it fully came on. Someone who could hear, through the closed door to the house, that the evening had not ended, only softened. The bag on the floor did not look important. It held apples, a loaf of bread, a small carton of milk, maybe the crackers someone liked to keep in the pantry. Nothing rare. Nothing that needed a story. But sometimes a familiar object gathers more than its own weight. Sometimes it carries the parking lot, the list written in a hurry, the reach for the least bruised fruit, the moment of wondering whether there was enough of something at home. Care often arrives like that. Not as a speech. Not as a clear sentence. Not even as warmth, at first. It comes in through side doors, with receipts in a pocket and a bag placed down by the shoes. It comes tired. It comes quiet. It comes with one more stop made after work, one more small thing remembered before the body could finally sit. She had seen that kind of care all her life, though not always while it was happening. There were hands from another decade inside those boxes. Hands that packed lunches, tightened jar lids, checked the back door, carried groceries in from cold driveways, and then said almost nothing about it. Hands that did not always know how to say love in a tender voice. Hands that sometimes sounded practical because tenderness had never been easy for them. The garage seemed to hold that, too. The old boxes did not explain anything. They only stood there, holding what had been saved. A winter coat no one wore anymore. A stack of school papers. Maybe a set of holiday lights with one strand gone dim. Objects from a life that had kept moving, even when people did not know how to say what they felt while they were living it. And there, in the middle of the present evening, was another bag. Paper. Ordinary. Slightly creased. She looked at it and felt something in her soften, not because the day had become simple, and not because the past had become clear. It softened because the bag was familiar. Because care had always looked a little like this. Set down quickly. Half noticed. Easy to step around. Inside the house, someone coughed once, then settled. She lifted her head toward the sound, the way she had done all day for other people, and the way she had done for years without calling it anything special. Not alarmed. Not rushing. Only listening. The grocery bag waited by her feet. For one more breath, she let it stay there. After a while, she bent down. Not quickly. Not the way she moved when someone was about to lose balance, or when a cup tipped too close to the edge of a table. This was a slower bending, one hand touching her knee first, the other reaching for the paper handle that had folded into itself. The bag made a small sound when she lifted it. A dry, familiar sound. She had heard that sound in so many years of evenings that she could almost place it beside other small noises of care. The scrape of a chair being pushed back in. The soft thud of shoes coming off near a door. The rattle of medicine in a plastic bottle. A faucet turned down so it would not wake anyone. A refrigerator opening late, then closing again with a tired little seal. Some sounds do not ask to be remembered. They stay anyway. The grocery bag was heavier than it looked. Not too heavy, just enough for her fingers to feel the pull. She shifted it against her hip, then paused before stepping up into the house. There was still a little outside air in the garage, tucked around the cardboard boxes and the jackets hanging on hooks. It had the mixed smell of concrete, old tape, and whatever dust gathers in places where families keep the things they cannot quite throw away. She looked once more at the boxes. There was one near the workbench with her daughter's old handwriting on it, still large and uneven from childhood. Another had belonged to her own mother once, with a corner worn soft from being moved too many times. The labels no longer held the whole story. They never had. They only gave a name to what could be carried. Photos. Ornaments. Books. Things. So much of love had been packed that way. In short words. In useful gestures. In bags brought in before dinner, in towels folded without being noticed, in someone standing at a kitchen sink with their back turned because it was easier to wash a dish than to say, "I am worried about you." She did not think the words exactly. They came more like warmth behind the ribs. At work, she had learned to notice what people could not always say. A hand gripping the arm of a chair too tightly. A patient laughing before admitting they were afraid of falling. A spouse answering too fast, saying everything was fine, while their eyes kept checking the person beside them. She knew that care could hide under efficiency. She knew tenderness could wear a practical face. At home, it was harder to remember. At home, she still became someone's mother, someone's grandparent, someone who knew where the batteries were, who had extra paper towels in the garage, who could tell by the sound of footsteps whether a child was sleepy or only pretending not to be. The roles came back to her as soon as she crossed the threshold. They were not bad roles. They were only full. The grocery bag brushed against her leg. She stood with it a moment longer. On the floor beside the door were the shoes everyone had left in a loose, honest pile. Small sneakers, one adult sandal, her own work shoes with the soles still holding a little dust from the clinic parking lot. There was no arrangement to it. No one had made the corner ready for a picture. It was just the place where people returned, one at a time, with whatever the day had put on them. Maybe that was why the bag touched her. It belonged to that same corner. It did not pretend to be anything else. It was the proof of a stop made on the way home, of apples chosen, bread remembered, milk brought in before morning. It was care with the receipt still folded at the bottom. She opened the door to the house with her elbow. Warm air came through first. Not dramatic warmth. Just the ordinary kind, the scent of dinner that had already been eaten, a little soap from the sink, the softer air of rooms where people had been living. The sounds were lower now. The television was off, or nearly off. Somewhere deeper in the house, a floorboard gave one small answer beneath someone's foot. She stepped inside and set the bag down again, this time near the kitchen doorway. For a second, she kept her hand on the top edge of the paper. The bag stood upright now. A little tired. Still useful. She felt tenderness for all the love that had entered rooms this way, carrying something needed, not knowing how to ask to be seen. The kitchen light was not bright. It fell in a small square over the counter, leaving the edges of the room softer than usual. The grocery bag stood near the doorway where she had set it down, close enough to be in the way, but not so much that anyone would complain. It looked like it belonged there for another minute. She let it stay. There was something gentle in not fixing the room right away. The apples could wait. The bread could wait. Even the milk, for one more breath, could remain inside the paper, wrapped in the quiet proof that someone had thought of morning before morning arrived. She took off her work shoes. One heel, then the other. The floor felt cool through her socks. In the next room, a lamp had been left on low, and the soft gold of it reached only halfway down the hall. The house was not asleep yet, but it had stopped asking so much. That was different. The rooms were still holding people, but not pulling at her with names and questions and small needs from every direction. She stood there, listening. At work, listening had been part of the job. It had a purpose there. It helped her know where to place a chair, when to slow down, when to give someone back a little confidence without making a speech about it. She listened with her whole attention, but also with training, with notes waiting to be written later, with the clock marking the next visit. At home, listening had no chart. It was just the sound of someone shifting under a blanket. The quiet scrape of a glass on a nightstand. The hum of the refrigerator turning on because the room had gone still enough to hear it. She knew these sounds without needing to name them. They had been the background of so many years of care that they had almost become part of her own breathing. The grocery bag held its place. Its paper sides were creased where her fingers had gripped too tightly. There was a darker spot near the bottom where something cold had begun to sweat through. She noticed it the way she noticed small changes in other people's homes: a throw rug turned up at the corner, a walker left too far from the bed, a light switch someone could not reach easily anymore. But tonight, the noticing did not become work. It stayed in her hands. She leaned against the counter and looked toward the garage door, closed now, with the boxes behind it in the dimness. Those boxes seemed less like clutter than they had a few minutes before. They were not tidy, and they were not asking to be understood. They were only still there. Old school papers. Holiday things. Maybe photographs someone had meant to sort on a Sunday and never did. A whole life can wait in cardboard. Not accusing. Not beautiful. Just waiting. She thought of the people who had loved her in practical ways, with voices that sometimes came out rougher than they meant to. People who bought the groceries, paid the bill, warmed up the car, checked whether the door was locked, and then moved on to the next thing because stopping would have made the tenderness too visible. For years, she had mistaken some of that for distance. Maybe some of it was. People can be close and still not know how to speak gently. They can carry food into the house and still leave words unsaid on the counter. They can love through errands, through reminders, through standing in the cold by an open trunk, while the person they love walks inside without noticing the effort. The room did not need her to settle that tonight. The bag was enough. She reached inside and took out the loaf of bread first. Its plastic was soft under her fingers. Then the apples, one by one, cool and firm, into the bowl near the sink. She moved slowly, not because she was tired only, but because the slowness had found her. The carton of milk went into the refrigerator. The crackers went into the pantry where someone would look for them tomorrow without thinking about how they arrived. That was all right. Some care is not meant to stand in the center of the room. Some care stays near the doorway, near the shoes, near the ordinary place where bags are set down and picked up again. When the grocery bag was empty, she folded it once. Then again. It did not fold neatly, but it became smaller in her hands. She held it there for a moment before tucking it beside the recycling, feeling no grand change in herself, only a little softness around what had once felt hard. The house kept breathing around her. And for once, she did not hurry past the tenderness. Later, she walked back toward the garage entry. Not because anything was wrong. Only because she had left her shoes there, and because the corner had a way of calling quietly after the house settled. The grocery bag was no longer on the floor. The groceries had become part of the house now. Bread in the drawer. Apples in the bowl. Milk behind the refrigerator door. Ordinary things, moved from carrying into keeping. The space looked a little emptier without the bag. The shoes were still there. She stood on the small step between the kitchen and the garage, where the flooring changed under her feet. Behind her, the house gave off its low evening sounds. A pipe clicked once in the wall. The refrigerator hummed, then steadied. Someone turned over in another room, and the blanket made a soft, brushed sound against the sheet. No one called her name. For a few seconds, that felt like a kind of rest. She looked down at the shoes near the door. Her work shoes sat beside the others, not separated from them, not important, only another pair that had come through the day. They had carried her across clinic floors, into other people's homes, through parking lots, down hallways with bright lights and handrails fixed to the walls. Now they were here with the small sneakers and the old sandals and the pair someone had kicked off without straightening. There was tenderness in the mess. Not the kind that made anything shine. Not the kind anyone would frame or talk about later. Just the quiet evidence that people had made it back. Feet had crossed the threshold. Bags had been set down. Bodies had moved from the outside world into the softer rooms, without ceremony. She rested one hand on the doorframe. The garage beyond was dim now. Only the opener light gave a weak glow over the boxes and shelves. From here, the boxes looked like a small town of cardboard, stacked unevenly, each one holding some old version of need. Baby clothes washed and saved. School projects flattened under other papers. Photographs from years when everyone's face was younger and no one knew which ordinary days would become the ones remembered. She did not open a box. She only looked. Some evenings are like that. They do not ask for sorting. They only let the past sit nearby without taking over the room. Her own grandmother had kept paper bags folded inside paper bags. A whole kitchen drawer of them. Brown bags, plastic bags, twist ties, rubber bands around coupons, old receipts tucked where no one expected them. At the time, it had seemed like clutter. Now, standing in her own house, with her own tired feet and her own family resting nearby, she could feel the care inside that's saving. Nothing wasted. Something ready. A small answer before anyone asked. It was not always soft, that kind of love. Sometimes it came with a sharp voice from the kitchen, or a reminder repeated too many times, or a hand reaching for the grocery bag before anyone else could help. Sometimes love sounded like, "Put your coat on." Sometimes it sounded like, "Did you eat?" Sometimes it sounded like silence, because silence was easier than saying, "I've been thinking about you all day." She had spent years learning other languages of care. Not in books. Not even on purpose. She had learned them in waiting rooms, in family kitchens, in the careful way a spouse adjusted a pillow under someone's arm. She had learned them from children who ran ahead and then looked back to make sure their grandparent was still coming. She had learned them from tired adults who said they were fine while counting pills into a small plastic organizer for someone else. Care did not always know how to be tender. But sometimes, after a long day, tenderness returned to it anyway. She stepped into the garage and picked up a reusable bag that had fallen behind a pair of boots. It was wrinkled, with a grocery store logo faded from too many trips. She shook it once and folded it loosely, then placed it on the shelf where she would see it next time. A small preparation. That was all. On her way back in, she paused before closing the door. The garage was still not beautiful. The boxes were still unsorted. The floor still held the marks of tires, wet shoes, dropped tools, years of coming and going. But the room felt different for a moment, as if it had been allowed to be what it was, not storage only, not clutter only, but a place where care kept arriving with its hands full. She turned off the garage light. The darkness came down gently. Inside, she checked the hallway once, not from worry, only from habit softened by love. A blanket was still pulled up. A glass of water sat close enough on the nightstand. Someone nearby was settled. She let that be enough. By the time she reached the quiet part of the evening, the house had almost stopped moving. Not completely. Houses with people in them rarely become completely still. There was always a small shift somewhere, a floor settling, the refrigerator taking up its low work again, the faint click of heat or air moving through a vent. But the louder parts had passed. Plates were no longer being moved. The sink was no longer running. No one was looking for a missing charger or calling from another room. She stood in the hallway with the lights low. The garage door was closed behind her, but she could still feel that room nearby. The boxes. The shoes. The grocery bag that had been folded down and moved out of sight. The floor no one swept perfectly. The place where the day entered the house before anyone was ready to call it home. It stayed with her. Sometimes a room follows you. She checked once more on the person sleeping nearby. The door was open only a little, just enough for the thin hallway light to rest on the edge of the floor. A blanket had slipped slightly, not enough to matter, but enough for her hand to reach in and draw it higher. The movement was small. It did not announce itself as love. It did not need anyone to wake and say, "Thank you." Her hand only touched the blanket, adjusted it near the shoulder, and then let go. The room remained quiet. The breathing stayed even. She stood there for one breath longer than she needed to. All day, her hands had helped other people return to small things. Holding a spoon. Standing from a chair. Reaching for a sweater. Moving across a room without fear taking over the whole body. She had watched people meet themselves in ordinary tasks, sometimes with frustration, sometimes with courage they did not call courage. Now her own hand rested against the doorframe. It was strange, how long it could take to come back to yourself after a day spent noticing everyone else. Not in a sad way exactly. More like arriving late to a room where your own name had been waiting quietly on a chair. She did not rush toward it. She went back to the kitchen and turned off the light above the stove. The apples sat in the bowl near the sink. The bread had disappeared into its drawer. The milk was cold behind the refrigerator door. Tomorrow, these things would be used without ceremony. Someone would pour a glass. Someone would reach for toast. Someone would take an apple and maybe leave the sticker on the counter. That was how care moved forward. A little forgotten. A little absorbed. She placed both hands on the edge of the counter and let her shoulders lower. The house had asked enough from her. The world outside had asked enough from her. Even love, good as it was, had asked it small steady questions all day long. For this moment, nothing asked. The quiet did not feel empty. It felt like a soft space opening around the parts of her that had stayed careful for too many hours. The listening part. The remembering part. The part that watched for imbalance, for hunger, for loneliness hidden under a normal voice. The part that had learned, over many years, that love was sometimes a grocery bag on the floor, sometimes a blanket pulled higher, sometimes a person standing in a garage with old boxes and not turning away from what they felt. She thought again of love that did not always know how to speak. Not with blame. The thought came gently now. Some people had loved with their backs turned, washing dishes. Some had loved by keeping gas in the car, by saving bags, by checking locks, by asking practical questions when tender ones were too hard. Some had loved imperfectly. Some had loved tired. Some had loved from the narrow language they were given. And still, something had reached her. The grocery bag had shown her that. Not because it was special. Because it was not. Because it could sit unnoticed on a garage floor and still hold the long shape of someone remembering what another person might need. She turned down the hallway. The house was dim around her, ordinary and imperfect, with shoes still loose by the door and boxes still waiting in the garage. Nothing had been solved. Nothing needed to be. Before going to bed, she paused near the entry one last time. No one saw her there. She let her hand rest on her own chest, briefly, not to make a promise, not to begin again with effort, only to feel the warmth of being here after so much carrying. Then she walked softly toward the room where the night had made a place for her. In the bedroom, she did not turn on the larger light. The small lamp was enough. She sat on the edge of the bed and listened as the house settled into its deeper quiet. Behind the closed garage door, the boxes waited. The shoes waited. The folded grocery bag waited somewhere out of sight, carrying nothing now, but still holding the shape of the evening. Her hands rested in her lap. They had carried, lifted, steadied, adjusted, remembered. They had done what love often does when it has no easy sentence ready. For a moment, she let them be still. Not everything tender had been spoken in time. Not everything careful had been understood when it first arrived. But some of it had reached this room anyway, through bags on the floor, through blankets lifted higher, through ordinary things placed close enough for morning. She breathed once. And the night made room.